Good morning and welcome to the classification community. Today we're going to be talking about classification structure practices in this webinar, and we're really excited to have you all here. We have our guest speaker, Richard Turner from Convergence Data. He has 15 years experience in the industry, and with that I'll go ahead and hand it over to Richard.
Thank you, Allison. So classification, as defined by Webster's Dictionary, systematic arrangement in groups or categories to an established criteria. Quite often we'll hear from our customers structure, taxonomy, schema, tree. Everyone has their own ways of describing classification, but I think the reasons for classification are usually similar. One may be for ease of retrieval, which is just making it easier to find parts, whether there are users of the parts or whether they're purchasers of the parts. Then there's attribute identification, which is defining the characteristics of those parts, which helps you in determining your classification structure. And those are critical for comparing items and getting and finding specific things. Classification can also aid in replacement or substitution. So proper classification should make it very easy to find an alternate or a substitute part, for example. Good classification will also help with creating new parts. You want to make it easy to create a new part so that you can maintain the standards of your classification. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, is reporting. Classification and attributes should help support any of your reporting requirements. Should only make it easier to generate reports that are accurate if the data has been properly categorized and normalized. So many companies ask us, where do you start if you're just getting started with classification? And there are many things that you can consider and look at. There are these consortiums like eClass, PIDEX, UNSPSC. Some companies just decide to go with something homegrown from the beginning. When looking at these consortium schemas like eClass or UNSPSC, it's just important to understand how they're used. A lot of those types of structures are primarily used by procurement to help with or aid in spend analysis. Their legacy is not necessarily attributes, it's more around category structure. But it may be something you want to look at to give you ideas, but we don't necessarily recommend it as an endpoint, but it could be a possible starting point. If you're in the oil and gas industry, there are industry consortiums like PIDEX, and they have very good classification structure for typical oil and gas items that you may want to take a look at and consider. For those that are looking at homegrown, starting it from scratch, just a couple key points. One is you want to avoid following a BOM structure. A BOM structure can be a little redundant. If you consider a lot of the same components are used in the same bills of material. You don't necessarily want to constrain your structure to levels, because that doesn't necessarily work for all product families. And you certainly don't want to constrain the structure or divide the structure by different divisions of a company or a product line. That basically defeats the purpose of classification, because the whole idea is to group similar things to make it easy to share across the enterprise. So some things to consider. Consider what your product families are across the entire organization and start from there. It'll be important to isolate the common components. Those are the components that are shared across the different product lines, or common across the different product lines that you want to share across the enterprise. That's a critical benefit of classification that you don't want to to miss. When you're getting started, though, you need to think about what are your goals for classification? What are your objectives? What are the use cases that you need to meet? And it's cross-functional. It's engineering, it's procurement. So you want to make sure you understand those before you get too deep into your classification program. Another key thing to understand is not only how you're going to search the information, but how you're going to report on the information. What types of reports do you want to generate? That'll be critical in helping you understand your classification structure. So some guidelines on the classification structure of the taxonomy. Common questions that we hear: how deep should your tree be? And there can be many things that you need to think about. One thing is, any system that you're publishing the data to, are there limitations? Be aware of those limitations as you build out your structure. Can you work around those limitations so you can come up with the optimum structure? You probably can. This information might not just be going to PLM systems, and maybe going to sales portals, and they may have certain limitations that you need to understand early on. When you're building your structure, make sure you use clear and concise naming conventions. Each tree should clearly identify the layers and the category names. Avoid redundant category names that will make it very confusing to those searching and creating parts. You want to take a structure down to a level that's driven by the attribute profiles on the categories. That really drives the levels in your classification structure. And as I mentioned earlier, think about the systems that you're sending this information to and what limitations they have in terms of special characters. You want to avoid those. One key point we'd like to make is you want to avoid using category names like an attribute. Define division of items through attributes, not in the structure. For example, use type as an attribute. That will significantly reduce the number of categories in your structure. For example, steel tube. Should the category just be tube, and should steel just be covered by an attribute like material? If you consider those things, your structure will be optimized and not necessarily too deep. Another major component to classification are attributes. So attributes basically define what the item or part is. There can be many attributes used on a category that define the dimensional information, material information, performance, temperature, pressure. If you have a lot of attributes on a category, you want to identify which ones are the key attributes. You want to make those required. Make sure there's information captured on those key attributes. Those will be the critical ones for searching and reporting. Beyond technical attributes, there are other additional attributes you may want to consider, like compliance information, supplier information, manufacturer information, information specific to each division of your company, commercial data. Those are additional attributes you can apply to your technical attributes. And when you're defining your technical attributes, you want to consider the data types for each attribute. For example, numeric attributes. What should the units of measure be? What should the default unit of measure be? What's the most common unit of measure for each of the items in the category? If you're using string attributes, you might want to consider using drop-down lists or pick lists so that people can avoid typing in information that may not be correct. You rather have them select it. And lastly, Boolean. Boolean attributes inevitably end up being used, but just be careful how often you use them, because they can limit searching and reporting in the future. So in our experience, as Allison alluded to, we've been doing this for 15 years, and here is just some stats we'd like to share with everyone that you might want to consider. 95% of classification structures are typically customized. 78% have a majority of levels or branches at about 3 nodes deep. And about a quarter of all attributes are non-descriptive. 62% typically have 10 or less root categories or top nodes in the tree. That's a real important thing to consider. You don't want to have too many categories at that top level. 95% of the master attributes are typically left as is when they're applied to a category. So what we mean by that is when you take the master attribute, there's no additional refinement of that attribute specific to that category. That's only about 5% of the time that we've seen. But you do want to make sure that you can accommodate that because inevitably there will be differences. And lastly, quite often we see about 15 to 20 attributes per category. Inevitably, there'll be a lot of attributes you'll need, both technical and commercial, to support the use cases for your classification program.
Wonderful. Thank you, Richard. That is very insightful information. I'd like to open the floor now and get some questions because I know the whole, the goal of this is to make sure we talk and discuss the questions and have other people in the community answer those as well as us. So please go ahead and start putting your questions in. I do have one here from Kelvin. He says, how do you determine when to make a node versus splitting out two attributes? So that's a good question, Richard.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I agree. Classification is an iterative process, and inevitably you'll go through iterations. You end up classifying parts against a new category. Then you start to look at the data and you realize, wait a minute, some of these parts in this category really have different attribute profile than others, and that's when you realize you need to break out your structure to accommodate those requirements. So I think the key note is you're not going to get it right necessarily the first time, and you'll go through an iterative process.
Great, thank you. We do have another question here from Gary. He'd like to know, what is the typical number of leaf/lowest level categories that we've seen?
That's another good question, and really, from our perspective, it's driven by the number of variations or variants characteristics an item may have. Some items have a standard attribute profile, and so you end up with maybe 2 or 3 levels in your classification structure. Others may have 20 to 30 different attributes and completely different profiles that may drive a much deeper structure. And that might be something as complex as, say, a valve. It's got lots of dimensional information based on the inputs and outputs to the valve and pressure and temperature ratings. And if you're using a lot of those, say you're an appliance manufacturer, inevitably you'll end up with a fairly deep structure for those types of items.
All right, and Sergio has a data modeling question for us. He'd like to know if you could elaborate on why binary fields may be undesirable.
So inevitably you'll have binary fields or what we call Boolean attributes. I'm not necessarily saying you should never use them, but they do have limitations when you go to use them, say, for search or description generation. If you could imagine you had 10 attributes on a category and 6 of them were Boolean, what we mean by Boolean or binary are true, false, yes, no type values. If you want to concatenate, say, a description from your attributes, it would be difficult to do from binary attributes. That would be a limitation. Search queries and reporting may also be difficult to do if a majority of your attributes are binary or Boolean. So that's something you just want to consider down the road, is how you're going to use this information, and then you may want to limit the number of attributes of that type.
Absolutely. And Derek has a question. He wants to know, do you have an example of the classification structures that we have that we can share with him?
So in this particular meeting, no, we don't, but certainly in future meetings, I think it would make sense for us to share some of the classification structures that we've used in the past. And, I think I mentioned earlier that every one of our clients ends up with a different structure. A lot of times, certainly for things like purchase parts, we will leverage categories and attributes from preferred suppliers' websites, for example. If inevitably the proprietary parts or customized parts, uh, we may end up building a customized structure, and we may have to reference that information in drawings versus supplier websites. So that's why every customer typically ends up with a different classification structure. But as I mentioned earlier, you may want to look at some of these industry consortium structures as a starting point, but it will evolve and eventually be customized to your products. That you'll definitely end up with something that's specific to your business in the end. But that's
Absolutely. Every tree seems to be a little bit unique, doesn't it, Richard?
yes.
So I do want to remind people right now, while you're putting your questions in, please also vote for the topics for the next meeting. We have some suggested topics here, but we certainly are open to anything that you would like to talk about as a group. Data modeling is one that is very popular, as well as data governance. PLM classification and data migration are all out there for topics to go ahead and vote on. Please let us know what you'd like to talk about next. We are planning on having this webinar, this group meeting every about 5 weeks, and we'll have topics that everybody is interested in and everybody can talk about and participate in. So I do see some votes right now for data modeling, and data governance seems to be a big topic, and I think that is a very important topic. So I think it's something we may want to consider for one of our future meetings, Richard.
Absolutely. Yeah, very popular.
Yes. All right, so just some house cleaning items here as we get towards the end of our time slot. Please look for an email containing this video. You'll be able to go ahead and share this, and if you want to have others participate in these meetings in the future, just send an email to info@convergencedata.com and subject line classification community, and we'll make sure we add everybody that wants to go ahead and join, because as a reminder, this is not a closed community. It's open to anybody. It's not just for customers. It's for every PLM or ERP system or any system that wants to know the best practices for classifying their part data and their product data. So with that, I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.